All right. I think it makes sense to get started. First and foremost, thank you for everyone, especially those that have logged on time. We do have a number of folks still coming on here, but we will get started. I do see a number of names that are clients, some that are prospects, and many that are new faces. So thanks for attending here. For those of you that do not know who Esgian is, for the new people, we are a market intelligence and data analysis company for the offshore wind industry, headquartered in Oslo, Norway. We have a market intelligence tool that we call Wind Analytics, basically providing transparency and clarity into the global offshore wind market. We're primarily helping developers, many companies within the supply chain, consultancies, government organizations, and many others, mostly with business development, strategic and competitive analysis, and a general understanding of the overall market. We have a full team of analysts. Every year, they sift through our database and come up with the top 10 predictions for the upcoming year. And so this webinar that we're hosting today is tends to be a fan favorite. It's one that we won't be able to cover all 10 of the predictions, just to be mindful of time, but we will cover many of them. I've got Oliver Stevenson on the line today. He leads our team within Esgian Offshore Wind. But I do want to encourage questions. If you do have any questions, please type them into the Q&A at the top. We'll do our very best to get to them at the end. We do host a monthly webinar each month on a timely and relevant topic. So at the end, you will see an area where you can sign up for our newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn to be updated on all events going forward. But with that being said, I'd like to hand it off to Oliver. We try to keep these efficient, timely, 20 minutes or so. But with that being said, Oliver, why don't you take it away?
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. Let me add my words of welcome to that as well. So let's get started and move through this relatively quickly. There's a lot to get through. We won't get through all 10 of these predictions for 2024 for the year ahead. We'll probably cover off 4 or 5 of them. I think we'll have time for that. But let's see what we get to. Squeeze as much as we can into the 20 minutes that we have, 15 more minutes to go or so. So as Ryan said, every year we take a look back at the last 12 months. We also look ahead to the next 12 months. All of the analysts help pull together these top 10 predictions that we have. Important to say that we don't think we're always going to be right with these. That's not really the point. We're not trying to just put forward the most obvious usual suggestions that are guaranteed to come through by this time in January, for instance. Instead, we're trying to challenge ourselves, trying to think a little differently about the market, about market conditions, understand some of the strategies and trends that we see playing out. They may not always be so obvious for either a developer or an OEM that's very focused on a specific country or a specific area of expertise. So with that background, let's crack into the top 10 predictions for 2024 that were originally released back at the start of January. So they've been out there for a couple of weeks now. And these are the top 10. Let me just start by highlighting the difference between the first 8 that you can see and then the last 2 of the predictions. There is quite an important difference between them. First 8 are predictions that we think will happen, that we have a high degree of confidence in, and that we think are going to be key important trends for the global offshore wind market. Last 2 are very different. They're predictions that we do not think will happen. We think it's very unlikely they'll come to pass, but we think it's definitely worth thinking about these issues, because even if the small chance of them happening does come true, then the impact is likely to be very large indeed. So think of these as 2 low likelihood but very high impact predictions if they do come true. As I said, we'll manage to get through hopefully 4 or 5 of these. If you do want to touch base on any of them, or if you want to get hold of the full report, please do reach out to us. Contact details will be available at the end. You can just reach out to Ryan or myself, and we can give you the full report if you want all of the 10 and the details around those. So let's dive straight in. In no particular order of importance, let's start with elections. 2024 is clearly a big year for elections around the world. I think it's something like more than half of the world's population will take part or has the opportunity to take part in a democratic election at some point in 2020. And our view is that this is going to lead to quite a lot of short-term uncertainty for the offshore wind sector. Short-term maybe needs a little bit of help with that definition. We can argue around what sort of time frame these uncertainties may last for. And there is certainly potential for some longer-term policy instability as well. If we look at the individual countries that are hosting elections, the US is clearly going to take a lot of the headlines and likely to be quite diverse. But other important elections will occur in existing offshore wind hotspots like Belgium, like South Korea, and we also saw already in January the elections that were held in Taiwan. But it's not just those more sort of established markets that we look at, it's also looking at the new entrance into the offshore wind sector around elections in some of these countries. Here we pull out places like Bangladesh, Finland, India, Lithuania, Portugal, even Uruguay, which will all hold national elections in the course of 2024. In addition to that, we've got EU parliamentary elections, which are scheduled for June this year. And as if that wasn't enough, the UK has to hold a general election at some time before the end of January 2025. So some point in the next 12 months, there will be an election in the UK. And expectations are that that will take place this calendar year. So clearly a lot of elections happening. If we try and understand what this means for the offshore wind sector, I think one obvious example here is to look at the uncertainty we've seen in the aftermath of the Spanish elections last year in 2023, and that uncertainty around how long it's taking to form a governing coalition and how that has led directly or indirectly, again, we can have that argument, but has certainly led to a slowdown in the development of that offshore wind framework in Spain. So clearly a victim of that slow process following those elections in that country. So what do we look at in conclusion then, running through this quite quickly? For us then, with so many offshore wind countries hosting elections this year, we do see this as quite a high risk for offshore wind development plans being delayed. And that's really largely down to more political horse trading that you see in the aftermath of these elections. That's the sort of thing that we're looking at, and a bit more of a heightened risk environment in those countries. Okay, so that was number one, around uncertainty and risk to do with elections. We move on to the second for this afternoon, which is number 3 in our top 10. Here we're looking at the rise of the Asian supply chain, which we think is already noticeable today, but importantly, we think it's going to strengthen over the next 12 months. Here we're talking mostly about Asian companies that have traditionally, historically had manufacturing facilities located in Asia. And that manufacturing base that we've seen build up for offshore wind historically over the last 15, 20, 25 years has predominantly been based in Europe, close to that demand center, European companies supplying into European offshore wind. But we're increasingly seeing Asian companies climbing the learning curve very, very quickly and developing their own set of particular competencies. And for us, this shows how quickly a supply chain can be mobilized. And here we're looking at, is this going to set an example for developments in North America, and then also potentially the growth of offshore wind in new areas such as Latin America or Australasia. And we do see that it's kind of moving as an interesting parallel between what's happened with Asian supply chain and then that subsequent wave of expansion of offshore wind away from that traditional European heartland. Will we see something similar happen elsewhere? Now, here it's important for me to say, okay, we can pull this all together and say the Asian supply chain, Asian manufacturing companies. But actually, we're seeing different approaches in different countries, as well as different approaches from different companies, as you would expect. It's quite simplistic to pull this together as just an Asian story. So if we look at some of the different countries, Taiwan clearly the first mover. outside China in terms of volumes of getting manufacturing capability up and running. They've also been able to establish a vessel fleet as well. I think it's fair to say some degree of mixed success so far with that manufacturing, but they've certainly made efforts in a number of different initiatives to grow that manufacturing capability. So that was where we are with Taiwan. If we look at some of the areas of focus for us, if we look at somewhere like South Korea, saw huge growth in the last 12 or 18 months, and a lot of companies very capable of supplying their own South Korean market now, as far as we're concerned, but increasingly targeting export markets. And also, interestingly, some of those companies looking at not just supplying from their South Korean manufacturing bases, but establishing facilities, factories elsewhere in Asia and potentially in North America and in Europe as well. So very ambitious expectations from a number of South Korean companies. Japan's slightly different. Here we've seen that initial focus on installation vessels. We now expect in the next 12 months or so to see some more announcements around new manufacturing facilities in Japan as their projects start to gather a bit of momentum. Both of which are slightly different from the other big market in Vietnam. A big slowdown in actual offshore wind development in the last 12 months in Vietnam. We don't really see any immediate signs of that logjam easing, but we do see a lot of Vietnamese companies very ambitious in targeting export markets, both in their wider Asian context, but also serving the European market as well. So expect announcements from a lot of Asian companies about new capacity, some new entrants joining the offshore wind sector as well. A big area of interest for us to track these different manufacturers and how they're targeting the market in both in Asia and overseas in export markets. Okay, moving through quickly. Aware of time and having to push through lots of concepts and ideas into the audience today. Let's move on to prediction number 5 around floating. Floating market has been the subject of a lot of excitement in recent years, a lot of people discussing and talking about how it's going to dominate. We take the view that 2024 will see the market becoming much more realistic. And that dose of realism is much needed, really quite important to start building, actually getting wind being produced operational from commercial scale floating wind farms. So, and for us, that needs that realism to take hold. What does this really mean? Well, initial announcement from developers really were about minimum floating project sizes that were multiple gigawatts in size. So really very, very substantial projects that were going to be floating. We don't think that's particularly achievable. So to us, that means that these gigawatt scale projects are going to be reduced in sizes and be developed as smaller phases. In effect, a slower, more gradual build out of that larger portfolio of projects. And for us, this benefits everyone. It benefits the developers in terms of their risk management. And it also benefits the supply chain, which will really need that realism to be able to scale up accordingly rather than face that enormous, huge wall of demand that's coming very quickly at them. We can see this happening already. If we take the example of South Korea, the multi-gigawatt projects that we see on the East Coast, those floating projects have largely been broken up into smaller phases. And we see this happening elsewhere, and we see this as a sign of maturity, that there's that much needed realism coming through for these floating projects. So it doesn't mean it won't happen. It's just going to be more staggered, more staged over time. Okay, let's move on to this one and take a little bit of time to explain what we're talking about on de-risking of project portfolios. Risk management for us is a key area for both developers and shareholders. Recent headlines that took the news the second half of 2023 were really around either stalled or abandoned projects in new markets. And a lot of those headlines have seen developers move to focus on operations in specific areas. We think it's now clear that projects are going to struggle to pass the investment thresholds in an environment that has generally higher interest rates than we've seen for the last 4 or 5 years, and definitely higher prices for components in a higher inflationary environment. So again, what does this mean? Well, we think that developers will focus on projects that are located in more familiar geographic markets. More focus will be on execution, bringing projects through the development funnel, through the pipeline, through to construction and operation. We did see this trend towards the end of 2023. One example would be Ørsted, the much publicized suspension of projects in the US, but also not bidding in Norway, pulling back from Vietnam. Not picking on Ørsted for any particular reason other than they tend to get a lot of publicity. This has happened more widely with other companies as well. And we don't see this as a negative thing either. We see this as a positive thing. You need to be moving through projects and focusing in on what you're best at. So for us, 2024 will be a year of trimming the fat for offshore wind developers and focusing on their core competencies. Again, a very positive change for us. Okay, again, aware of time and pushing this through as quickly as we can. Let's look at our last prediction for 2024. Let me just quickly reiterate, this is not a prediction we expect to come true. We think it's highly unlikely, but we do include it as an example of what might potentially come true. And if it did happen, that there would be significant consequences for offshore wind. Let me run through the scenario we're looking at here. The scenario is a cyber attack on offshore wind infrastructure. We chose Europe, but it could happen anywhere. It's just that the installed base is somewhat larger in Europe than in any other region today. So if we use our imagination a little bit, some unknown third-party group, an undisclosed group of hackers, for instance, takes control of, shuts down an offshore wind farm, the immediate impact is likely to be a very rapid rise in power prices through big, widespread concerns about the vulnerability of the wider power grid in that country or in Europe as a whole. As a reaction, we can certainly imagine a more protectionist approach from the EU. As a consequence, that might include possible restrictions on sourcing of equipment in the future, concerns about the ownership of assets by states that are deemed to be unfriendly. These sorts of issues can quickly snowball. We may see countermeasures and potential lack of key components, all of which adds and causes to disruptions to projects that are under development, projects that might require spare parts, projects that are under construction today. Now, this may all sound a little bit dramatic, a bit far-fetched, but we have seen the huge impact that denial of service attacks, that cyber hacking can and does have in other sectors, and wind should not be seen as being immune to these threats either. That said, it's certainly an area that developers are being forced to pay increasing attention to today, and we are seeing that with a lot of the actions that developers and OEMs are taking. So again, I stress this is not something that we see happening, but there is a risk, and it's one of our predictions that is highly unlikely, but would have a major consequence if it did happen. Okay, that was 5 of our top 10 predictions for 2024, which I ran through very quickly in the 20 minutes that we have available today. Those 5 are highlighted in blue here. I did mention earlier, and I really stress this, if you're interested in hearing our thoughts on some of the other issues here, what might happen in the US, why do we think Italy might finally get things built for offshore wind? And maybe what on earth retail has to do with offshore winds? Think companies like IKEA or even Lego. Or if you want to know what our view is on sustainability and lease rounds, then please do reach out. We'd be very happy to have those discussions. We can share the report with you. So let me open it up there. Back to you, Ryan, and we can round things up.
Excellent. Thanks, Oliver. Very, very insightful. I do want to encourage, if you do have questions, please type them in. There are no questions right now. But I do want to touch on a number of things, just recap what Oliver had mentioned. We did go through just half of the predictions that we came up with for 2024 If you would like the full report, there's a number of ways to get that. That is simply email me. You see my contact information right there. I also encourage you to sign up for the newsletter. That's with the QR code right there. We send out quarterly reports, market reports on this newsletter, and you're informed of all upcoming events that we put together. The next month, we will host our webinar on our quarterly update, where we're going to highlight the previous quarters and the previous month's activity. And just a reminder, we do keep these webinars and presentations to 20 minutes. That is on purpose. We don't want a huge ask of time from our attendees, and trying to get the most bang for your buck and make them very, very efficient. So I hope everyone found this beneficial. I don't see any questions, but I do hope to see everyone next month. And again, I encourage you to reach out if you have questions, want a demonstration of our data platform, or just want to talk offshore wind. We are here to help. With that being said, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.